from having, started obviously researching flow within an entrepreneurial context directly, and then having been in entrepreneurial contexts, what is some advice you would give founders to achieve the goal of growing their company, well and fast, but by leveraging flow? I think ultimately, what people want the most, whether, flow is going to help with this or not, is in that context, success entrepreneurially. So what are some of the peak performance or flow pieces of advice you would recommend to someone who is kind of locked into some sort of entrepreneurial success as the primary outcome?
Well, there's a ton, right? And we can talk about it from the individual flow level, and we can also talk about it from the team flow level, right? So let's start
individual, and then I'd love to go to team as well. And then I've got some questions as well. We'll loop back to the research you're doing right now afterwards.
So there's a lot of analogs between flow language and entrepreneurship language. And, any discipline is really just kind of learning the lingua franca of the other. Oftentimes you see so many similarities in there. And I try to connect the dots with entrepreneurs, going from Aristotelian philosophy, using Aristotelian philosophy to kind of bridge the difference between entrepreneurship and, or even Stoic philosophy. For some reason, the headier and more academic you are, the more they tend to resonate with those kinds of things. But first and foremost, I think you got to start at the beginning, which is, as Simon Sinek always talks about the why. What's your why? What's your purpose? And, we can go into self-determination theory and intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation. But in the end, there's not going to be flow and there's not going to be success if you don't have intrinsic motivation. And you can separate the entrepreneurs from the wantrepreneurs really, really quickly that way. The real entrepreneurs, they're myopically focused on solving a problem. The entrepreneurship by definition is value creation, but really it's about solving particular problems that people have that aren't effectively being solved right now. So if you're not passionate about the problem you're solving, particularly if you haven't even experienced that problem yourself, you're going to be far less likely to have success at that domain. Of course, there are exceptions, and there are people that are opportunistic and just happen to be timely and all the stars align just right. But as entrepreneurship gets more global and more competitive, there's something called founder market fit. And founder market fit means, are you the right person to solve this problem? Are you the right person for this business? And I tell young entrepreneurs all the time, does it make more sense that I give you $1 million for 25% of your business? Or do I give you $2 million for 51% and fire you and put someone else in your place that could do it better, right? So if
that's a great question, by the way. I love that, to dwell on it for entrepreneurs.
You got to be the right person. It's got to be, it is your competitive advantage as an individual. There's very few entrepreneurship theorists I like, but there's one at the University of Virginia named Sarah Sarasvati. She talks about effectuation, studying all these successful entrepreneurs around the world for years. She identified something called the bird in the hand principle. Bird in the hand principle says successful entrepreneurs build businesses based on what they know, who they've experienced. What they've experienced. So what resources do I have as an individual that makes me unique? Build a business that's within your image. So you need to have a purpose, you need to have the motivation, and you need to have the connection to that problem. That's probably the foundational piece.
Yeah, I love that as a foundational point. And given all the emphasis, obviously, within the entrepreneurial world on lean and agile and customer discovery and gathering feedback and pivoting based on that feedback to get product market fit, how do you reconcile doing what the market tells you should do with doing what you are passionate about and where your founder market fit lies?
Well, it really depends on context, right? Like with Steve Jobs, they talked about the reality distortion field, right? Where the market was telling him something totally different. The advisors were telling him something completely different, but he followed his instinct and he basically made the market become what he wanted it to be. He created the change, and sometimes disruptive innovation requires something like that. if you're a very practical entrepreneur and you want to find a nice little niche and carve out a small business focused on something very narrow, then yeah, you're probably going to have to make some trade-offs, right? It may not be your core vision or your dream in the end, but if you want to do something extraordinary, right? Something truly disruptive. It's what Steve Blank calls Horizon 3 innovation, right? The ones that don't take over markets or market share. They literally create entirely new markets. They do something so profoundly different that the world is affected. And I think in those situations, you're kind of myopically focused. You have a vision and you're trying to convert people. It's almost like proselytizing, right? Like a missionary would do. You're trying to convert the people around you to your way. Does that happen very often? Definitely not. That's the rare exception. So yeah, there are trade-offs along the way, but I think the bigger question is like, how do we manipulate and manage that journey? Like you talked about discovery and engagement, in the end, like the market is going to dictate things. The customer is going to dictate things. If they don't like what you're selling, they're not going to buy it. And if enough people don't buy it, you're not going to have a business, right? So there is some kind of realization there, but how do you optimize that particular experience, I think, is what's more relevant, because successful firms are guided by successful founders. Optimal firms are guided by optimal founders and optimal team members, right? So if you think of like the collective of an organization, if they have that gestalt where the sum of the parts is greater than the whole, and they're performing so well together, chances are they're going to be able to manage those pivots and those dynamics more effectively. So, when I was starting the study, people were asking, hey, are you going to look at the outcomes of the businesses? And in my take is, it doesn't matter how great everyone performs. You might be able to reduce the likelihood of catastrophic failure or immediate failure, but they're external variables, the market, the competition. There could be global catastrophes or pandemics or all sorts of unforeseen variables that could determine the efficacy and the outcome of the business, that no matter how well you perform internally, it's outside of your control. And that, of course, is one of the interesting aspects when you look at the triggers and the kind of characteristics of flow, the sense of control, the ambiguous feedback, the clear goals, and you got moving goalposts that you're often chasing. So it makes, at least for founders in certain roles, especially the kind of top level original founders, CEOs, core strategic decision makers, there's a number of those flow characteristics that are really, really hard to achieve in that context.
If what you've heard on Flow Research Collective Radio has been helpful, please consider doing us a solid and leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening to this. Reviews help us connect to a wider audience so we can get these peak performance principles out to more people.